Okay, so for my second vodcast, obviously I interviewed my dad, and my dad is in his mid-60s. He is 65, and so I found quite a few connections throughout our conversation that I felt were pretty relevant to our course material and connected well to what we talked about in class. Obviously, I asked quite a few questions, so I thought I would just go over some that I thought were perhaps the most impactful. Something I asked my dad right at the beginning was, at what age did he start to feel like an adult? And when I asked him this question, I kind of assumed his answer would be very similar to what he did actually end up saying. Coming to America in his early 20s was when he truly first felt like an adult, and I thought this was really interesting because it really corroborates the idea of emerging adults that we talked about in class. I think that as a society, we view turning 18 as becoming an adult, at least like in the United States and in Ireland, where my dad is from. However, for most people, adulthood really doesn't start until after college or kind of like independence from family. And then instead of just turning 18 and thinking of yourself as an adult, there's really a period of time called emerging adulthood where you're technically an adult but not completely independent, which is kind of very typically experienced by college students, I feel like. I think my dad is a great example of this, as he said, because he moved to America right after graduating and then really started an independent adult life and started to view himself in that way. I also asked him if he could relive 1 year of his life, which would it be and why? And I kind of referenced a question we were asked in class for this. If you could go forward in life and experience maybe being in your 60s, would you do that? Or would you go back in life and experience being 7 again? So my dad said that he would relive 2006, which was the year that my twin brothers were born. One of them unfortunately passed away. So my dad would have been 45 at this time. I thought it was a very interesting answer because in class I noticed that most people who I would assume are about my age, so early 20s, said that they would rather go back and relive age 7, kind of experience being young and carefree again. I thought my dad was going to say something similar to that, especially because he lives a very stressful life with his job being such a big commitment. So I was shocked that he picked a year that was not only very notably hard for him, he was also very middle-aged at this time. I think it shows that from an older perspective, the idea of growing old and potentially losing youth is really not as scary as people make it out to be. Instead, what my dad said was important to him at this time is the valuable lessons that he learned that year and how he would do some things differently to kind of put my family in a better situation. And to me, that really shows how his values have shifted as he ages. Instead of putting himself first, he really mostly cares about the people around him that make his life better. Then I also notably asked my dad, he works in finance. A lot of his friends are reaching the age where they're considering retirement. So I wanted to know if he worries that he could potentially face ageism going forward, or even if he has already begun to experience that. And again, I was very shocked by this answer because despite being on the older end of the workforce, my dad really has no plans of retirement soon. But I do think based on the position he's in, for context, he's the CFO and kind of in a weird position where he's also the CEO right now. He has the luxury of really not having to worry as much about ageism as I would imagine others do, since he has a less traditional boss. There's not one singular boss he has. It's a board of directors who are all about his age. However, I think he is absolutely correct that there is unjust ageism in the industry, even if he hasn't particularly faced it, especially when he said that a lot of his friends have been turned down from positions because it felt like they maybe couldn't keep up with the pace, even though they had the relevant experience. I really like his take, actually, that age can be an asset in the workforce, since with age obviously comes experience, and that can be extremely invaluable. I know in class we discussed how younger people view older people as potentially slower or maybe less capable, so I really appreciated my dad's perspective on this as an older person in the workforce, that age is really oftentimes an asset. And I do also wish, and we'll take this into my corporate life post-grad, that younger people would adapt to the mindset more easily, be less skeptical of age and just more open to learning from people who have been in the industry the longest, because I do think there's a lot to learn there. I also talked to my dad a little bit about midlife. and I know that's a very pivotal time. In class we discussed how midlife can be pivotal for most people, but also very challenging for a lot of people. I feel like this is kind of where the term midlife crisis comes from, because a lot of people in that time will often like maybe pick up a new hobby or do something very like extremely differently in their life to maybe cope with this challenge. I know that my dad, as I said, went through a lot of challenges at this time in his life, with one of my brothers passing away. So I wanted to kind of hear his perspective on how that impacted his life after that point of midlife. And I really appreciated that he acknowledged the difficulty of the challenges that he faced, but he also said they were such important learning opportunities for him that he still applies to life to this day. And that kind of really shifted even my perspective on midlife. And I honestly don't really like the term midlife crisis. I think it's kind of just like we need to have more compassion and empathy for people who are experiencing this point where there's so much going on and you're kind of settled down for the first time with kids and like at a more serious point in your job. Anyway, I also asked my dad a little bit about my granddad. So as I said in the video, my granddad had dementia. That's my dad's dad. And then my mom's mom had Alzheimer's. But yes, my granddad had dementia. So I wanted to know if, because of this, my dad would maybe approach planning for the future differently than someone else would, especially because there are other diseases that we have a history of in our family. So again, like as we talked about in class, a person's genetic history can play a major role in how they should be theoretically planning for the future. And as for my dad more specifically, I know that he's lived his life very cautiously to try and prevent inheriting dementia as well as those other illnesses. Even from a young age, I know this was something he was very cognizant of. All his friends would smoke, even his siblings would smoke, but he was very avoidant of it just for health reasons. I also know that he planned his finances very carefully so that if he ever needed to receive treatment for something like this, he would be able to do so without burdening his children. And I noticed that even now he makes a huge effort to go out and be social since he works entirely remotely, and he very much believes that not socializing enough played a huge factor in contributing to my grandfather's dementia. And while I am very grateful that my dad is so meticulous about this, I do feel bad that it has to be such a lifelong burden on him, and it really shows me how important it is to consider your health and genetics when looking at life ahead of you. And I try and follow the patterns that he does. I'm already thinking about my finances, how I'm going to plan for that. I avoid anything I know that can have a direct impact on my inheritance of dementia or Alzheimer's. So then going a little more into a different aspect of dementia and health, I thought that my dad's overall take on the actual dementia, not the genetic portion, was very interesting. I know in class we talked about how it's very often the natural choice for the oldest daughter or wife to become the caregiver for a parent with dementia. And this was exactly the case for my family when my granddad began to show symptoms. I know that in the interview, my dad agreed that my aunt taking care of my grandfather was the best option, but seeing how it kind of slowed and then borderline almost stopped the trajectory of her life until his passing was very sad for me, and I know a lot of my family to watch. I know in many cultures, taking care of your like aging, potentially sick parents is common and does show respect and is obviously like a very kind gesture, but I do wish that the burden didn't so often fall on the women of a family. I also asked my dad if he thought that my granddad and my nana were the same people that they were prior to being diagnosed with these illnesses, and he did say no. I asked this question because I recall discussing in class if a person with a disease such as Alzheimer's is even themselves anymore, like at a more progressed point in the disease. And I honestly am inclined to agree with my dad's answer that towards the end of their lives, once the disease had progressed a lot, both of my grandparents really were no longer themselves. They kind of had none of their original qualities or personalities, and they couldn't even remember early childhood memories, which I know are usually the last to go. I also think that towards the beginning of this semester, I feel like we talked a lot about how people's priorities shift drastically as they age, so that's why I chose to ask my dad what he feels like is most meaningful to him now, and maybe how that's changed since he was younger. In my first Vodcast, I asked my roommate MP her priorities now, and she's 22 for context. They were mainly friend and career focused, I really wasn't super surprised to hear that my dad, who's obviously a lot older than MP, say that he experienced a huge shift in priority once he had kids and started to visibly age more. While he did say that his career used to be all-consuming, he now cares most about his family, friends, kind of hobbies, ability to enjoy life. And I find this both sentimental but also sad, because I think that as people age, they start to really realize that they're not going to actually live forever, and only then does the mentality kind of shift to actually making the most of life instead of just focusing on making money and having a very successful career. And then something I wasn't really planning to ask, but I thought was interesting that it came up, is our brief discussion about life expectancy forcing people to work longer. Something that really stood out to me in a class discussion was when we talked about how people are beginning to live longer, so they need to work longer to support themselves in retirement. And as someone who is both older and in finance, I thought my dad would have a really good take on this. I felt that he made a very valid point, that when he said that this could potentially increase ageism in the workplace, as well as make things harder for graduating college students entering the workforce, which I feel like I can already see that happening as the job market just gets smaller and smaller each year with in respect to the number of positions that are open. I also thought it was important to ask my dad this question about kind of like physical health, and if anything has changed in regard to how he takes care of his physical health over the years. I feel like personally I have seen him start to care so much more about his health in the last decade, as he went through his 50s and now in his 60s. And as we had talked about in class, health becomes a much bigger deal to people as they age, since they start to kind of realize the repercussions of what could actually happen if they don't take care of themselves. My dad's really not an exception here. He started to experience a lot of health problems in his 40s, I would say, and then immediately got serious about spending more time outside, picking up golf, eating better, regular doctor's visits. And I do really wish that this was something that younger people, especially in college, kind of took more seriously earlier on. I think that when we're young, we truly do take our health for granted, and this could cause even more issues as we age due to the lack of consistency. So that's something that even as a 21-year-old, I am very aware of in my life. And like I said, I already do take preventative measures to try and make sure I'm not inheriting any genetic diseases I could possibly avoid, but also just for the benefit of my overall health. So I really enjoyed making the second podcast. Although I do spend a lot of time with him, I feel like I learned a lot about my dad, and things that, just like questions that I never would have thought to ask came up, and so many new perspectives. And yeah, I really appreciated this.